What's the difference between a dictatorship and a democracy? Turns out it is all in the math. A political scientist looks at Game of Thrones ahead on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Lisa Beth Kovetz. Today we're going to talk about why modern politics is really just like Game of Thrones. Joining us is Alastair Smith, the Bernhardt Denmark Chair of International Relations at New York University and co-author with Bruce Bueno-de-Mesquita of the Dictators Handbook. Dr. Smith, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
In Game of Thrones, the HBO series adapted from George R.R. Martin's novels A Song of Fire and Ice, the good guys often lose. And that was a big shock for lots of people reading the book or watching the series, even though, in reality, lots of bad guys win and win a lot. Dr. Smith's book, The Dictator's Handbook, explains why. Today we're going to start with one of the baddest guys on Game of Thrones, Ramsay Bolton, bastard son of Roose Bolton of Dreadfort, and if you still can't place him, he's the guy who emasculates this guy, Theon Greyjoy. Alastair, in real life, the world is full of evil leaders. How do such bad guys stay in power?
Well, I love the Ramsay Bolton character. I know most people despise him, and most people despise him because we were fortunate to grow up in democratic society where there's a lot of political constraints. So to see someone acting so brutally and so outside the rules is very unusual for us. But for the vast majority of human history, many places today, killing people, brutally getting rid of rivals, fighting your way to the top is the way that politics works.
In the Dictator's Handbook, Dr. Smith breaks down the way someone like Ramsay would stay in power if they understood the difference between the Nominal Selectorate, the Real Selectorate, and the winning coalition. What are those groups? And if I wanted to be a dictator, say, how would I manipulate them?
So think of the Selectorate as everyone who has a nominal say in who's going to be leader. So in the US, that's the voters. Then we might think that some of these voters matter more and their decisions actually really matter. So there's particularly distinction between voters in China and the Communist Party, for example. And then we've got the small number of people that actually matter. So this can vary from a few hundred people all the way up to tens of millions of people in the United States. These are the people that keep the leader in power. If you lose the support of these people, you'll be deposed. So the important thing is to build a coalition of just enough people and then pay them very well.
So if we apply that to Game of Thrones, then we would say that before he got eaten by his own dogs, Ramsay Bolton's winning coalition is his Bannerman.
That's absolutely correct. He knew the important people to keep him in power. You notice nobody in the Game of Thrones, with the exception of Daenerys, goes around trying to make the peasants' life better. They're all interested in keeping those who keep them safe, protect them from the peasants and their political rivals and other kingdoms. They're the only people who get paid. So the currency here is everybody's handing out castles to knights that keep them alive. And they're trying to build the support base. They marry important people. It's all about who can promise to deliver rewards to people. So the Bannerman, the important people here. This is why we find it so strange, is that you're trying to keep a small number of people happy in the Game of Thrones and in many modern political societies too. North Korea, you've got to keep a small number of people happy there, but we're used to living in a democracy where you've got to keep millions of people happy. So the kinds of things you do are very different. If you want to keep millions of people happy, you can't just hand out castles because there aren't enough castles to go around for millions of people. So you do things like have a productive economy, law and order, a clean environment. Those are things that make a lot of people happy.
And that's where the math comes in, the math of power.
Yeah, exactly. You want to think about how many people you need to keep happy. The smaller that number, the easier it is to survive in power. As the number gets bigger and bigger, the amount of money per person becomes really small. So you have to think about different policies. But that really changes the calculus of how people are loyal to the political leader.
Because there's not enough money to bribe all voters.
That's right. So, right, they simply can't pay everybody enough. And if you try to do that, someone will go along and propose law and order, right? We never see any law and order in Game of Thrones. they keep law and order in the palace, but there are marauding bands killing peasants and left, right and centre. We never see the king worrying about, let's establish a police force or similar security services to protect those people from the bandits. That's not because they're not important to him politically.
So how important is the winning coalition to Jon Snow or Ramsay Bolton or really any leader ever?
It's absolutely important. It's the only things that matter. You can't do anything as a politician if you're not in power. And you're not in power if those around you need to keep you in power, protect you from rivals, protect you from foreign enemies, if they're not loyal. And this loyalty is a very symbiotic process. You'll notice that people get deserted by their supporters very quickly. So the idea is, it's not that you're just paying someone today, it's that you're going to keep paying them in the future. And it's that idea that you're going to keep backing me, I'm going to keep paying you. As soon as people think, the future with this person looks grim, then they start to desert. So you sort of see Daenerys when suddenly her husband dies, and then suddenly virtually everyone deserts her overnight.
Let's talk about loyalty. Is that winning coalition always made up of the same people who get the leader into power?
Well, initially they are. It's absolutely key that you pay people who bring you to power. And we see this a lot. You have to pay someone to defect, like Walder Frey gets paid to help the Lannisters. But whether he'll be around for the long run is much harder to tell. So everybody pays somebody off to bring down the former leader and get to power. But once you get there, you go, yeah, I didn't like that guy. He's already shown disloyalty. He helped me come to power, killed the previous lord. Let me put in one of my buddies in place. So this is, for autocrats, this coming to power period is the riskiest, because you have to keep the current group of people happy. At the same time, you're trying to slowly replace them and purge them and just concentrate power with those that you really trust. So all dictators always have trouble staying in power for a few years. Once they're established, then they can wipe out those that got them there. We see this all the time. Robert Mugabe turned on his own people who'd fought in the bush with him to fight against White Rhodesia. We see it in Kim Jong-un having his uncle killed like 3 years after he'd seized power. Well, the uncle was absolutely key to getting him there. So we see this in political leaders, that they're very insecure to start when the king first comes to power, and then they purge a few people, and then if they get through 3 years, they tend to be in there forever.
A lot of purging in Game of Thrones. And the Dictator's Handbook suggests that if you change the size of the winning coalition, you change the world. How is that?
Well, it's the simple idea of political loyalty is very low when you're beholden to a lot of people. When the coalition is large, you can't just buy off people and get this really strong symbiotic loyalty. So we might want to compare North and South Korea. South Korea has a coalition. I did a study, and I remember having these experts really vehemently arguing over whether it was Kim Il-sung at the time, whether he was beholden to 7 people or 8 people. Right? Keeping 7 or 8 people happy is much easier than keeping 10 million people happy. So the kinds of policies we see between North and South Korea are massively different. People live Game of Thrones like in North Korea.
But if in America, if we want to keep as far away from dictatorship as possible, even if your neighbor totally disagrees with what you, with your politics, you should put them in your car and drive them to the polling station with you, because in many ways it's not even what they vote for, but that they vote.
Democratic politicians are different in the sense that they're beholden to as many people as possible, but they're always trying to contract the number of people they're beholden. So we see voter restriction laws, right? All this licensing problems, or you've got to have a formal ID, particularly where they do it, they're disenfranchising people who aren't going to vote against them. Gerrymandering is another place. We divide it up so that you end up with a very small group. We have things called sour loser laws. So if you run in a primary and don't win the primary, then you can't run in the general election. But often the primaries have such low turnouts that very small groups make it possible. You have to appeal to a very small, you're a very Republican state, you can get 10,000 NRA supporters to reliably turn out. You're pretty much guaranteed. So who's really keeping you in power in a very gerrymandered district? It might be the 10,000 people who promise to turn up if you support gun rights. This is democratic leaders also are doing their best to keep the number of people they need very small.
It's terrible. It's terrible.
No, it's not terrible. It's politics. And if you think it's terrible, you might be morally appalled. But if you just sit there and be morally appalled, then you're going to lose at politics. The thing to do is to think about protesting to stop politicians getting away with that. Democracy is very, very stable because for the vast majority of us, whether we are Republicans or Democrats and who's in, even if we're very much in touch with the winning party, is the difference between the Democrats or the Republicans being in is very valuable compared to being a winner or a loser in the Game of Thrones or a winner or a loser in North Korea. So democracy is very stable because once it's established, we have the rules of law and we're going to abide by those because it's much better to be in that system than imagine having a purge and ending up like North Korea or the King of the North. Most of the people won't be Bannerman to the King of the North, and they're going to have miserable, miserable lives. So it's very stable. Of course, in the other situation, the kingdom is very, very stable too, because for the few people who are in the top, and they're typically drawn from this small stack of nobles who could potentially be in the coalition, their wealth is massive. They don't want to sort of start expanding and diluting their power. So both ends, these sort of really tight autocracies and really established democracies are great. It's the wasteland in the middle where we can actually see change.
It was very interesting also because we were talking about Julius Caesar. You were talking to me about Julius Caesar, and what we see in drama from Julius Caesar is a sort of heroic, semi-heroic story. It's complicated, but you were talking about the money under Caesar's death.
So Caesar makes the classic mistake. Caesar tries to help the people. I think he's like one of the greatest leaders of all time, a fantastic general. He seized Rome, he won the Civil War, he was fantastic. But then he got into power and he wanted to relieve the debt burden and slavery. A lot of citizens sort of accumulated debts during the wars, and they ended up, the penalty there for not paying your credit card bill was you became a slave. So, and he wanted to take away
that
this
happens
slavery.
here also in a certain way.
But this was actually real bondage, not just, anyway. But, so the truth was he actually wanted to help the people. So he tried to relieve debt burden. He tried to reverse some of the slavery. He also had tons of innovative ideas. But let's take a guess at who do you think held the debt? Who held the slaves? Who was going to be rewarded? It turns out it was the very senators who stabbed him in the back. He was taking rewards from those who kept him in power and giving it to the people. It's beautiful as an idea, but in practice it's going to get you killed.
He did not understand his winning coalition.
Right.
He didn't read your book.
He was way too great a man to have time for, anyway, it's in the wrong language. But, you know, we could go back to the Game of Thrones. Who's the only person in the Game of Thrones we actually ever see trying to help the people is Daenerys.
And there is the eunuch.
Well,
all right.
Let's focus on Daenerys. So she's the only one who goes around trying to release slaves. Now, her problem goes, she has sort of these unrealistically loyal, unsullied soldiers, but she captures these cities, and now she's got these cities, but she needs to feed the people. She set them free. She needs the economy to work, or all her soldiers are going to starve. So what's she got to do? She's got to rely on the people who were running the system before. And we see that they're very unhappy. She's released their slaves, depriving them of their wealth, but she still needs them to help the economy run. So she can't completely purge and have them all killed. So she's got this problem, and she's busy taking resources from them to liberate slaves. She's taken their resources away, so they rise up and try and kill her. Now, absent 3 dragons, turns out politically dragons are very useful.
That is a seriously aggressive winning coalition when you have 3 magic dragons.
But she would have been killed in the arena. I can't remember what episode it was, but she was basically, her guards were overpowered by the rebels, and she would be dead. The reason at the end of the day was if she'd just left the slaves in slavery and allowed the elites to keep all the business and power, they would have been much more elite. They would have been less likely, they would have been less angry. They wouldn't try to. I mean, she's alive, but she's the only character who tried to help the people, and she would be dead, but magical dragons do help. Yeah,
Deus Ex Machina is a great political tool.
Yeah.
On the heroic side of George R.R. Martin's saga, we have Robb and Ned Stark, honorable, good men who lose their heads. Ned Stark is doggedly determined to follow the rule of law, and that keeps him alive for all of 10 episodes. Robb Stark also follows the rule of law, except when he doesn't feel like it. He marries a woman of his own choosing instead of one of Walder Frey's daughters, and he is dead in Season 3, Episode 9. In Game of Thrones and in real life, does this rule of law matter, and if so, to whom?
So we think of the rule of law today as following written rules, and so that really matters in democracy because we believe in the independence of the judiciary, and so if you break the law, even if you're a politician, you'll be locked up and jailed. The rule of law in a small coalition environment is whatever you want it to be, so long as you pay your supporters. The number one rule, pay your supporters. That's the most important thing, and develop this symbiotic loyalty. The Starks are terrible politicians. They're everyone's hero because they're going around doing valiant things, although you might notice you never see them protecting law and order to keep the average person alive or promoting the agricultural economy to help the peasants. So they're not that good, but they're trying to do the right thing. But they're political novices, so Robb Stark gets killed at the Red Wedding. This was gross stupidity. He needed Walder Frey, and Walder Frey said, what I want this promise of long-term rewards, not short-term rewards. I want to marry into the family, and that way it's going to be very hard for you to cut me out from keeping my castle, keeping the flow of rents, being an important person at court. And Robb spurns him and says, I'm not going to give you to this. So what's he think? He knows he's on the outside. Robb doesn't value him very much, and so he's not very loyal. And so what happens? Robb Stark's stupid enough to then go stand in the court of the guy who's just told, you're out of my coalition, you're not important to me, I don't value you. What's he do? He takes the money from the Lannisters, he kills them. Now he's in the Lannisters coalition. We don't know how long the Lannisters will keep him, but Robb had already told him, you should never tell an enemy, you should never tell someone in your coalition that you want them out. The first thing they should know about it is they're dead or they're in jail.
Would he have, for us, someone heroic like Robb Stark, would he have made a good leader for us with his willy-nilly rule of law feelings?
He wouldn't have done well in this time because he didn't have good policy. He wasn't devising things to help the peasants. His father had exactly the same political naivety. We like him for being the honourable guy who's trying to find out who the real king is. The real king's the guy who's on the throne, who's paid the guards to keep him alive and bring the revenue to him. It doesn't matter genetically who's related to who. It matters who's on the throne and whether they're loyal. So Ned Stark was being a fool. The Lannisters were not interested in finding out that their son on the throne was not legitimate.
Right.
So they had him killed.
Right. So in many ways, Stark, not understanding the complexities of the political world, is he very much like this new crop of young legislators who are coming to Washington and not... They keep saying they're not going to be part of the world of power politics that we're seeing. What do you think? Are they lambs to the slaughter?
They're not lambs to the slaughter because it's a large coalition.
Well, and we're a
rule of
democracy.
law matters, but even when they're in power, they may have said many, many things, but they can't do everything that they said they were going to do. They're going to find a subset of all the voters who voted for them and cozy up to them and do things that they want. They don't want to win. Nobody should try and win everybody's support in their district. You want to win at most half the votes in the seat you have. Anything else, you're wasting resources that you could have used for some other reason. And in nearly all states, 70% of people vote. You disenfranchise a bunch, you gerrymander the districts, and the politicians are interested in staying in power, not doing the right thing. So very few politicians fall on their sword by trying to do the right thing. And even if you do, once you're out of power, you can't influence the process anymore.
In Game of Thrones, everyone's rooting for their favorite character to take the throne. But Dr. Smith's book, The Dictators' Handbook, is pretty clear that all leaders everywhere are, if not the same, they are servants to these identical forces. As a professor of political science and given the world of Game of Thrones, do you think that Daenerys Targaryen would end up being the same kind of leader as Ramsay Bolton?
Well, trying to help the poor, she'd be dead, but for some dragons. So, in reality, she'd probably end up being killed by rivals or someone turning on her. But if she carries on trying to expand the coalition, bringing people in, releasing slaves, trying to build what we might think of as a more modern society where much more inclusive society, she's going to run into this roadblock. She wants to be Queen of Westeros. If you have an encompassing coalition, then those people you build into this coalition, they have views of their own. Why would the people of, I forget what the different kingdoms are, the different cities are called, but why would they want to go fight and die in Westeros, a land they've never seen? So she's got the choice. If she really wants to be the Queen of Westeros and keep loyalty, she's either got to contract the number of people she needs, or she has to give up on being Queen of Westeros and accept that she'll be voted out of power, but probably in a less bloodly, it'll be a bloodless removal of power. But, you know, I think that the reality was you're going to end up being, you know, sort of Aung San Suu Kyi. One moment you're this glorious Nobel Prize winner for human rights and democracy, and the next minute you get to power, push comes to shove, and you end up, you know, you're committing genocide.
Okay, so do you think she only did that to stay in power, only did that to increase her own power, or are people evil?
I don't think that, I mean, there are evil people. We have Bolton, who clearly is pretty evil. Just, you know, his leisure time is pretty evil.
Yeah.
But, you know, what he does in his leisure time is not particularly politically important in a small coalition system. Most people go into politics, I think, with this idea of helping other people and promoting an agenda. But when they get there, they find they can't do anything unless they stay in power. And so they start worrying about paying off the people who keep them in power and contracting those people. They may still think they're trying to do the best thing, but they're stuck. They're stuck between this rock and the hard place. I want to help the people, but if I help the people, I get kicked out, and then I can't help the people. And, you know, maybe Ramsay Bolton will come in next, so they think I should better stay in here. So everyone gets in this vicious cycle of having to take a slightly more dreadful act because you don't want Ramsay Bolton taking over from me. And in the end, you find out, yeah, you're locking up people and disenfranchising people because that's how politics works.
The model of leadership tactics in the Dictator's Handbook is called Selector Theory, and you might want to check out this book because some people are calling it the theory of everything. In fiction, stories that rely on Selector Theory are everywhere. In film, it's The Godfather, it's The Walking Dead. In video games, you can't play Total War without building a coalition. In real life, what else does this theory apply to?
Oh, it applies to any organisation, basically. There's somebody at the top of the organisation, and generally that person's sought that position and they want to stay there. Often they can siphon off resources for themselves. They can pay themselves a large salary in a corporation. It applies to anything you want. We could think of a charity. We could think of a university, but I do need a job. You know, we might apply it to the condo board. Because you need some votes to stay on there, and you get to say who can buy and sell. You get a lot of control, and so all of these organisations happening. We can think of corporations, right? We might think of the family-owned company is very much a monarchy. There's somebody at the top. There's a relatively small number of family members, but you can only pick those supporters from a relatively small number of family members so it's like a kingdom, small coalition, small selectorate. We might want to think of the modern limited liability company as sort of a rigged election autocracy. Why? Because the reality is there's millions, hundreds of millions of shares out there, but they're really only voted by a few big players. So most of us, you know, we have our 401k, we could go vote, but, you know, our votes are so insignificant that we never actually exercise that power. So power, I'm nominally entitled to vote in a lot of company elections, but I never do, and my vote doesn't matter. It's run by these few big pension companies, and so we can think of those as the winning coalition that keep the CEO in power.
Unless you can control Deus Ex Machina or have magical dragons, you need somebody to keep you in power.
Right.
So if bad behavior makes good politics, how do we use this information to prevent bad behavior?
Well, it's a great question, and the answer is it's very hard because politicians want to contract the coalition, because if they can contract the coalition, they can get away with being more like Ramsay Bolton and less like someone who's trying to enrich the poor. So the thing to do is to always be wary of institutional moves politicians make. When they want to redistrict things, they want to redistrict things to make sure that they survive in power. When they introduce new rules, when they introduce regulations, all of these things, voter enfranchisement rules, all these things are designed to keep them in power rather than help the people. What should we do as citizens? We should vocally protest. We should support candidates that want to reform those measures. I think one of the things we should do is really push politicians to enact institutional change that will take place in the future. So no politician wants to change the rules that's going to get them kicked out of power. So for example, gerrymandering. Right? Nobody wants to take that away today, but if they wrote rules and voted on them today to say these rules would come into effect in 10, 20 years, those people don't care so much anymore, because they will care about the government being run well in their retirement. They will care less about it keeping them in personal political power, because they're probably retired by then. Whereas if we say, we want you to do things that are against your own interests today, it's very hard to get politicians to go along with that.
You have left me frightened and hopeful. Thank you so much for spending time with us. It was a great pleasure.